I was going to shuffle it around, but it looks to me like the lineup has some practical and effective order in space one never necessarily finds order, so if you find it, you might as well stay with it. For those of you that don't know me, let me briefly introduce who I am. The introductions of the speakers are going to be very brief. I expect them to add any features that they want to help you understand where they're coming from. Chairman Mao once said that in order to know where a man stands, you have to know where he sits. By the way, if you have time for it, do read Chairman Mao's little red book. I think you'll find it quite insightful. No man can lead that many millions of people without having something practical on his mind. I'm not sure I'd adopt all his philosophy, but at least he is a practical organizer. Let me just sort of tell you who I am and where I come from. I spent 30 years in the United States Air Force until I graduated, and that happened about 3 years ago. I had a misspent youth as a lawyer, and I've been trying to live that down ever since. When I left the Air Force, I decided not to practice law because if you practice law, you have to associate with all those lawyers. I now am the Executive Vice President for Space Commerce Corporation, which is a marketing arm, if you will, of the Soviet aerospace industry, Cosmos. The job that I had in the Air Force immediately before I left was the competition advocate, and as the fellow said, I now represent the competition. We can go into that later, maybe tomorrow morning in particular, depending upon how time permits us today. My experience in teaching, and I have taught at University of Colorado, Colorado Springs, and Webster University, and people have even had the mistaken belief that I knew something, so they've invited me other places to speak, is that people learn best from the questions they asked, not from the material that is presented to them. So in that vein, what I intend to do is have each of the speakers give you more or less a 15-minute overview, basic understanding of what they've come to say, and then with penetrating questions from the other speakers and from you, we'll have a 15-minute, give or take, 20-minute question and answer, and then go on to the next speaker. My experience has been if you hold all your questions at the end, I've forgotten who the first speaker was by that point. So, in order to glean the most out of the rich kernels of wheat that we have this morning, we'll kick it off. There is water in the back. Please feel free to get up and go back and get it as you need. I don't think there's a dish of mints. You'll have to steal those from some other room.
The microphone is a recording mic too, by the way, not just a PA mic. So you just kind of tilt it in your direction if you want to sit down and talk so that we can put you on tape as well.
Clear?
Thank you.
Okay. Any other pieces of administrative before we get the bus on the road? No questions? Okay. I guess for the sake of argument, this is the business economics session. I should hasten to add that I think that encompassed within that is politics, a certain amount of engineering, and maybe even some practicality. I can't vouch for the latter, however. People always try to give me, by the way, very serious explanations of why things are happening or why things aren't happening, either in terms of sort of religious themes or political themes or cultural themes. I always look for the money, as Deep Throat said. If you look for the money, somehow you will find where their philosophy comes from and why, I think in large measure, people do things. Not that that's bad. I think economics is a practical application of fundamental principles. And towards that end, we will explore those themes today. We'll follow right straight through. We'll call on Dr. James C. Bennett to lead off, and we will go from there. We'll take a break at about 10:30. I suspect what's going to happen during the break is some people will flee, and others will want to talk to the speakers that are here, and that's probably fair game too. So if you're a speaker and you want to flee, we may give you 2 minutes to get out of the room before we call the break.
Hi, I'm Jim Bennett. I am co-founder and currently corporate vice president of American Rocket Company. We are, as most people are familiar with, entrepreneurial space company based in Camarillo, California. We were founded for the purpose of providing commercial space transportation to Earth orbit, and are in the middle of our program to carry that out. As an entrepreneur, it gives me some qualification to talk about the topic today. But what I wanted to do is primarily give people a historical perspective, because space entrepreneurship is a relatively new thing. We had flight to space altitude since approximately 1943. We've had orbital flight since 1957, but for almost the first 40 years of the space age, activities were carried out almost entirely by government bodies, of those primarily by military bodies, a minority of government civil activity. Private companies were involved almost entirely as contractors to various government agencies, with one exception. Very early on, within 5 years of launching the first satellite, we began having commercial companies getting involved in the construction and operation of communication satellites. However, that was a very isolated and segmented field, because the attitude was, well, they could run ComSats, but they can't run anything else. And this remained really in this mode until the late 70s. At this point, a couple things happened. Actually, the space shuttle was a great spark to space entrepreneurship. And this is because people began looking at the projections for shuttle flight rates and for estimated shuttle prices per pound to orbit, and people started reading the literature of the imaginative things that could be done in space through material processing, remote sensing, all of these great things. And a lot of people said, gee, if the launch is going to be that frequent and that low cost, why, I could put together a business, launch things on the shuttle, and do this or that with them. And you had a great deal of speculation. And there was a pioneer named Paul Siegel, who has not been in the field for quite a while, but in the late 70s, put together a AAS conference in October 1977, San Francisco Airport Hilton, business in space. And it was rather amazing to see what came out of the woodwork, because all sorts of people came up and gave talks about all sorts of things you could do in space. So there was one slight problem. It's a lot of people had expected the shuttle to fly on schedule in 1977, and it was delayed to 1978 or even 1979. And the business plan started to get a little stretched out, and funding was a little hard to get. But by 1981, the shuttle did fly, and a number of people were trying to float various business plans. However, by that time, other entrepreneurs who had started to project space businesses began finding out more about the shuttle program, calculating some of the trends out, talking to a lot of people involved in the program, and came to the conclusion that whatever the shuttle was or wasn't going to be, it was not going to be 100 or even 48 flights a year. It was not going to be $10 or even $100 a pound. As a matter of fact, it began to look like it was going to be prices per pound, certainly cost per pound, well within the traditional range. So at that point, a lot of attention started turning to looking at, well, if you can't launch something on a shuttle and make money off of it that way, maybe you can make money launching things in space. There's been an eternal chicken and egg problem in space entrepreneurship and space business. There's always been bright groups of people with good plans to provide this or that segment of what was needed in the market. However, if you were planning an application in space, you were stuck for transportation. If you were planning transportation to space, you were stuck for applications. Because when you would go to the venture capitalists, you go to the corporate funding sources, you go to the banks, you go to the individual investors, and those are the sources of money that are available in the United States right now. You sit down and you say, well, we're going to build a rocket. It's going to cost us X to build the rocket. It's going to cost us Y to operate it, and we can sell the service for Z. And all these people out here are going to buy it and pay Z, and then we're going to make 10% or 20 or 30% of the as profit and return it to you. Well, that's all very well and good, assuming that you can build it, assuming that you can operate it, assuming that it'll work. But even after you're selling the service, show me the customers who are funded. Show me the customers who have a commitment of funds to buy your launch service. And you're in trouble because the customers are also entrepreneurs like you for the most part. And they don't have the funding. And when they go to get the funding, you find that the venture capitalists say, well, this is all very well and good, but how are you going to launch it? So, well, I'm going to launch it on this private service that's being built. Well, they don't have any funding. You can't prove to me that they're going to be in operation in time. So this is the eternal chicken and egg problem. The promise of the shuttle in the late 70s was the first thing that happened that even helped address this problem, because you can say, well, it's going to be launching the shuttle, and that's being done by NASA, so it's got to happen in the right way, okay? Yeah, sure. So a bunch of people got started then. Myself, I got into the space entrepreneurial aspect of things right at the end of the 70s. Became a consultant to a project which ended up becoming two companies. One was called Space Services Inc. and the other was called GCH Incorporated. Space Services Inc. was founded in Houston, and several people in this room had some connection with the groups involved in it. And it went from being a company that was going to buy rockets from GCH, operate them, and sell the services, to a company that is going to contract for its own vehicles. Went through many permutations, and just last fall won the comet competition from NASA CCDS, and got acquired by DER, the big beltway bandit firm up around the DC area, and they're finally going forward after about 10 years of planning. I was a consultant to the GCH and on-site and launch regulatory issues for a fairly short period of time, and then one of the things that happened with that whole cluster of companies and enterprises that bred a lot of people who started having yet more and different ideas about how to do things in space, and some of the ideas were different from the ideas that the company was founded to pursue, so a lot of people went off and started pursuing their ideas independently. Myself and several other consultants that had been working with that project, in 1981, founded a space transportation company, which we called ARC Technology at that time. And we weren't very explicit about the space transportation because at that time we felt that it was saner to develop your technology first and then tell people what you're doing, because if you told people that you were building rockets in a private entrepreneurial fashion and you hadn't accomplished any hardware demonstration, people gave you an extremely large amount of skepticism. So for a while we had a rather generic and non-descriptive name. What was happening at this point, you're getting into, this is about 1981, 1982, you had a number of small entrepreneurial companies who were beginning to experiment with technology, address the launch question on that side. The payload applications, again, aside from the communication satellite field, were very much in the nascent or seed state. There was groups of people with good ideas and business plans and an attempt to get money and not much more. So the whole chicken and egg problem sort of renewed itself at that time, because by that time there were very few people that would really count on the shuttle being available unless you had a major deal working like Space Cab or Space Industries, and I'll get back to those. But the whole drive towards commercialization of space, private enterprise in space, business in space, came from a number of different sources. The entrepreneurial source, which I'm describing in one group of people who got into it, was one. At the same time, and in a very different viewpoint, a very different approach arose, and that came from the East Coast business world. And you had a fellow named Klaus Heiss, who was a economic analyst in nutrition. He started looking at the shuttle operations and saying, well, if it does what NASA says it's doing, then this activity should be privatizable. The market should be able to support the construction of new shuttles and their operations. So he formed a company with a financier named Bill Sword called Space Transport Inc. This was got going again about the end of '81. They worked on a shuttle privatization proposal for a while, but they did not have a lot of success in the policy realm. Part of it was that the government was getting informed enough about the actual performance of the shuttle, actual economics of the shuttle, that they were getting nervous about committing to a deal where they would continue operating and a private source would began financing, because for the deal to be equitable, both sides had to perform more or less according to original expectations. And they were getting nervous that wasn't going to happen. So then they said, well, you have this other fine rock, Big Martin area Titan 3, which is about to go out of production. Because at that time, remember, everyone was confident enough about the shuttle that they said the Delta, the Atlas, and the Titan were going to go out of business. And I said, well, if we're going to have the Titan go out of business, why don't you let us take over the rights to produce it? Why don't you let Space Transport Inc. operate it, and we'll sell it at a profit. At the same time, a group of people up at Goddard Space Flight Center who had worked a lot with the Delta over their history, David Grimes was probably the leader of them, had a similar idea about the Delta. They formed a company called Trans-Space Carriers Inc. And they tried to raise money to get the privatization rights to the Delta and continue that. And of course, there was a lot of comment about these guys being totally unrealistic because they would never be able to provide services cheaply as the shuttle, and these 30-year-old obsolete pieces of technology ought to be allowed to make the graceful decline and go out of business. At the same time, most people thought that the entrepreneurial sector was completely crazy. GCH built one rocket for SSI, and it was a very early experimental type test, which was the rocket design was called the Percheron. It was it was about the size and performance of the old V2, and it was the first module, what was going to be a clustered module approach. It was a LOX kerosene liquid fuel rocket motor using a TRW engine design. And toward the end of 82, they had it up on the test stand down in Texas. They had it on the test stand in Texas. No, it was 81. But they went to have their first static engine test where they had the vehicle on the stand in an upright mode, which is unusual because usually you test the engine statically for a while before you put it into a vehicle. Unfortunately, they had what was known as a hard start and suffered a vehicle explosion and lost the vehicle. That put GCH Inc. out of business. SSI continued on its own and switched over to the idea of using solid rocket technology, off-the-shelf surplus solid rocket technology, which is kind of the third strategy for getting into the space transport business. First being develop new engines, new technology on your own. The second being take one of the existing government rockets that's being retired and privatize it. And the third one was take components like solid rocket motors that were being produced for the military or existing NASA industry and adapt them to what we all tend to call the mix and match mode of building rockets. So on our side, ARC Technologies identified the hybrid rocket motor as a technology that we thought was a great promise for commercial space operation. This is, some of you may not be familiar with it, it's a type of rocket that uses a solid fuel element and liquid oxidizer. In our case, the liquid oxidizer was liquid oxygen, and we used synthetic rubber called polybutadiene, which is basically hydrocarbon like oil that you just harden and forms a solid. It's commonly used for synthetic rubber tires. Most tires are now made out of polybutadiene. So if you use binder for solid rocket fuel, where you very carefully mix in some ammonium perchlorate, hope it doesn't cook off, and cast it into a fuel grade. The nice thing about the hybrid, of course, is that unlike everything else, the fuel grade is something you can toss around, put a match under, light bounce, put electric sparks to, or static electricity, and it's not going to cause you any problems, even when it's cast into a rocket motor. So you don't have to carry these around and bounce them around. And lately, we've had a little one-pound thrust tabletop demonstrator, which we've been lighting in people's offices. Wakes up even a NASA meeting at the end of the day, which means that it's a very lively item. I like it because when we run it, all the people that have had solid rocket motor experience immediately retreat to the furthest corner of the room and themselves against the wall. Because you work with one type of propulsion for 30 years, it's hard to believe that the other won't go, but the Air Force spent a good deal of time with the Bennett trying to make this stuff explode. And they made us put blasting caps on it and set it aloft, and they made us soak it in lots for 24 hours to see if the lock-soaked fuel was an explosive combination. And they took these frozen solid pieces of polybutadiene, put blasting caps on it, and blew it up, and we went out and picked up all the pieces and fitted them back together and showed that what you had was exactly what you started with when you blown into a lot of little pieces. Anyway, ARC had originally identified that. It had been worked on by UTC on government contract, but the development was never finished. It was never turned into a motor that you could actually take out and fly. We picked up as consultants some of the old UTC senior engineering personnel, and that demonstrates another way that the rise of entrepreneurism began to fit together elements that had been there in industry before, but put them together in a new way, which is actually a lot of what entrepreneurs do. So ARC eventually became Starstruck because we had an investor who liked the name. And as Starstruck, it carried out a water launch offshore of the Pacific Ocean of a 40,000-pound thrust hybrid-powered rocket called the Dolphin. We were also experimenting with the water launch mode developed by the Navy back in the early 60s. It was designed as a low-altitude exit test to see whether the control system on the rocket could right it if it exited the waves at an angle, which it did. It achieved its program flight of 15 seconds, at which point we shut it off because it didn't have the pressurization system to fly to the high altitude we really wanted. So we just said, we'll do the first 15 seconds because that has most of the data we want to get out of this test. The Navy's about to do a similar test with the liquid-fueled rocket called the, it's 12-Truax X3. And this was yet another entrepreneur who was up there. Bob Truax actually began trying to build a small liquid-fueled rocket using surplus Atlas Vernier control engines as early as the late 70s. Basically improved some of the technical points he was making, but got stuck for funding for about 10 years, which is something that happened. Since he was a genuine garage operation, he had a big 3-car garage in his house in Saratoga, California. He was able to park the rocket in his garage and just continue on his retirement income. Not being retired people ourselves, we had to continue to raise money and build hardware. So the picture evolved from one of scattered entrepreneurs that most people didn't take very seriously in the early 80s to a couple of crazy financiers and retired management types proposing schemes to privatize existing rockets, and a few people that were beginning to look at existing components, putting them together in a new fashion and flying those off, people like Pete Staking at SSI. And all through the early 80s, this just kind of drifted along, and one of the problems was that because it was chicken and egg problem, because of the lack of private payloads which were readily available to fly on these things, both the payload field and the rocket field suffered from a great lack of capital. What was happening was that there were 3 real centers of crazy money in the country, and it's probably still the case. One is the East Coast, where there's so much money running around that some percentage of it has to be crazy. One of it is Texas here, where people have a long history of taking high risks and getting high payoffs and being willing to consider almost any kind of risky investment if the payoff was high enough. And of course, California, and particularly in our case in Silicon Valley, where people had a recent history of taking high technical risks and doing things people said was technically impossible and making a lot of money out of it. And that is the profile of the people that invested in the California companies, certainly. And I think that David Hanna and a lot of the other Texans that put money into SSI are definitely supporting Texas gentleman type. And it's a good thing that the country has diverse sources of capital and people with different mindsets in different parts, where at least a few of those parts can tolerate high degrees of risk and tolerate high degrees of craziness. However, crazy money only gets you so far. And what really began to get the field working was the set of policy and administrative changes going on in Washington and fueled by the rise in space entrepreneurs. At the same time, people in the White House, the Reagan White House, were beginning to think, gee, we're for private enterprise and NASA is costing so much money. Couldn't we get private enterprise to take over some of the projects associated with NASA or in and around NASA and both relieve the government treasury of some of the obligation to support these things and to see private enterprise established in space a little more. Because you had people coming in from Texas, people coming in from California like myself, people coming down from New York, all saying, we've got to get more private enterprise in space. So you really had kind of a two-pronged approach. One were these various entrepreneurial business type ventures where people were raising money in the private field and trying to either build rockets or buy rockets and operate them. The other were projects like the original OSC project, the TOS, which was an upper stage to be deployed out of the shuttle and launch satellites commercially. That got done in '83. Space Hab, which originally started as a space tourism concept, but soon went from carrying passengers to carrying material processing experiments to space, and the size of their module shrunk quite a bit. But that evolved as another cooperative project with NASA, where the idea was you take one piece of what NASA is doing, supported by private capital, have an arrangement for feedback. And of course, Max Faget started proposing the industrial space facility through his Space Industries Inc., which was, of course, a small, deployable man-made space platform for research. And all of these two universes, which began being very far apart, began growing more and more together during the 80s. What really drove it were the 2 years from '84 through '86, and the driver was in the policy area. You started with the fact that people like me, people like Dave Hanna, kept coming into the government with rockets and said, well, we're going to fly this rocket. What are you going to do about it in terms of making sure we don't collide with the satellite or violate your treaty obligations? And finally, after a year or two of dithering around, they said, no, I guess we have to do something. So they had an executive order which set up the Department of Transportation as the lead regulatory agency. And shortly thereafter, Congress passed a bill, Commercial Space Launch Act of 1984, which took the executive order, basically wrote a law along the same lines, passed a law, codified the executive order, people say. And that not only set up the regulatory apparatus, you knew what it would take or what it wouldn't take to launch a rocket. It stated that the only grounds on which you would judge it were going to be international treaty obligations, public safety, environmental, and defense concerns. And which meant that this whole raft of economic regulatory issues, which the CAB, for instance, and the ICC used to judge people on, were never going to be established in space. And it gave us the right to operate off the federal ranges, which was very important. It took about 3 or 4 years before we got a range use agreement that we could actually sign and use, but the principle was embedded at that point. That was the first of the several steps of actions. Of course, the Challenger accident happened in the middle of all this in early '86. And that finally made people realize that the original flight rate projections, or flight rate projections as of the early '80s, which were still a quarter of the original flight rate estimates they had made, were not going to be made. The actual flight rate was going to be a lot less, and that the cost that we were paying was a lot higher. And therefore, I said, all right, let's stop thinking that we have the capacity and the low cost to carry commercial satellites in orbit. Let's reserve the capabilities of the shuttle, whatever those are, for defense and civil scientific missions, because we're going to have a hard time just carrying out all the defense and civil scientific missions with the shuttle's capability as it is, and encourage the private sector to provide the launch service. And they also realize if we're going to have the private sector in the launch service, you want the private sector providing as many other aspects as possible. So you shift over from a government-driven economy to a private-driven economy. And of course, the fundamental bottom line reason why you want that is that you don't have to go back to Congress every year for appropriations to have the activity to carry on. If you're doing something in space for profit, the investors come around and they want to put more money into it. And as soon as that's really demonstrated, the sooner that dynamic is going to get going. So in the last half of the decade, driven by these big changes in policies, you saw a lot more entrepreneurial activity in the launch area. You began to see a lot more entrepreneurial activity in the payload area. And by the end of the 80s, you got this situation where there wasn't a clean, sharp line between the people doing cooperative agreements with NASA, like Space Hab or ISF or OSC, and the people out there building rocket garages and approaching the launch field. You began to get more of a continuum of a lot of different strategies, both providing space transportation and for providing the different services from orbit. And the other big transition that happened, the last piece in this stone, because the first piece was the Commercial Space Launch Act. The second piece really was the federal policy of the fall of '86, which said the shuttle was no longer going to be a routine source of transportation for commercial payloads. And the final piece was the government space policy of January 1988, which said the government was not only going to encourage the private sector to exist and to launch, but also the government was going to start using private launches for its own needs. In other words, just as the federal government buys air transportation, either by buying an officer a ticket when he's going to fly across the country, chartering aircraft for a whole charter to the Mideast or wherever they need to go, or, in the very minority of the cases, running a government-operated aircraft. The same way the government would start buying space transportation services. And of course, this was said very nicely in the 88 policy, and change, as usual in the federal government, was very slow. So fortunately, a number of people from the National Space Society chapters got the idea of trying to do something legislatively and start out with an almost impossible crusade to pass something called the Space Launch Services Purchase Act, which got passed last year. So this is a whole set of steps with the purpose of transitioning over from a government-driven economy and government-driven activities to an economy that was primarily private. In other words, we bought and sell space transportation, we did services in space, we bought and sold space goods and services in the same way that you sold any other fairly high-ticket item and fairly high-risk activity. But the private sector is full of high-ticket item, high-risk activities, and it's got a lot of ways to handle it. And one of the ways of showing this is realistic is just looking at the insurance picture for a minute, because when we first started out, a lot of people said, you're never going to be able to get any insurance for these things. Nobody's going to insure a private rocket. That's crazy. Well, we went over to Lloyd's, and we sat down and broker it. We just went to an aviation space broker and said, we're going to fire off a rocket and we're going to buy insurance. Yeah, well, go over to Lloyd's and talk to these people and explain what you're doing. Let your fuel samples over and talk about non-explosive rockets. And, so they said, all right, you need X amount of insurance. The DOT said you need this amount of insurance. They wrote it. They actually, the premium was quite reasonable. And they just said, look, it's just a question of levels of risk. We insure liquid natural gas tankers docking in harbors and crowded cities. We insure 747s flying over rows of houses coming out of airports. We insure all sorts of extremely high-risk activity, much higher risk than yours. Yours is not a problem at all. As soon as we can quantify the risk, we can write insurance for it, and as soon as we get the experience, we'll lower the premiums. Providing, of course, the experience is what you claim it's going to be. And that's just one example of bringing the whole set of private solutions which are out there and available. The problem...
I'd like to go to questions pretty quickly.
Okay, just 3 more minutes?
2.
Okay. So that's where we are today. There's been a lot of accelerating activity in the last just 3 years, really. The government has finally begun instituting programs like the Common Material Processing Program, where they're buying the launch services from the commercial sector in a commercial fashion. And you've had a whole set of NASA and Air Force procurements where they're buying the launch services from the commercial sector in a commercial fashion. And this is just becoming more this way. So what does this hold out for the future? Well, just to give one interesting example of where this could be to in the long term, and you just have to take as your guides and look at how it's done in the commercial sector, look at the real situation, what are the real risks, what are the real capital being done, and say, look at the space activity and ask yourself, does it meet this profile yet? As soon as it meets the profile, it will be privately financeable. The sooner we get the chicken and egg stuff worked out. But look at the space station. What are the purposes of the space station according to the NASA criteria? One of the most important purposes of the space station, one of the most important goals, is acquiring biomedical data on human beings in space. And this is actually one of the main remaining purposes after a lot of the other ones have gotten knocked out of contention by various factors. You look at what they're going to spend. You could be very reasonable to say they're going to spend $100 billion, and one of the main products you're going to get out of it is going to be 40 million years of biomedical data on humans in space. And he said, we define biomedical data from humans in space as a space good or service and bought it in a commercial fashion. We could write a contract saying anyone who wants to provide the U.S. government with 1 year of biomedical data garnered in space will pay not $2 billion, which is what you average it out from the station. I'll assume there's no other return to the station, which is not true. Say we just pay $20 million Maybe start out with 50 and have it decline to 100 million after, to 20 million or even 10 million after some number of years. Right now, you could write a contract for that using exactly the same format as the other format for writing space goods and services. And there's at least one person in this room that's willing to sell a year in space on a commercial basis, I believe. If there was a market for it, there would soon be others. And it seems outrageous now, but I recall when 10 years ago I stood up and said that people would be building rockets on a private basis and flying them. People said that was crazy too. And unfortunately, I didn't have enough time or opportunity to really go through a discussion of some of these ventures in detail, and I didn't even get into the whole history of my own American rocket, but there was some opportunity for that question. I think that those things are becoming better known. But the main point here is that we have seen in the last 10 years a very difficult and very painful transition from an almost entirely government-driven way of doing things to a way of doing things which at least exists in outline form as a total commercial infrastructure. We have commercial providers of launch service, commercial payload users, commercial payload providers, and the task now is one of fleshing this out and adding as many different diverse sources of space goods and services. So,
Excellent outline of the perils of Pauline.
yes.
Are there some questions by our panelists?
Jim, you've really kind of outlined a three-stage process, one in which government is the space company, if you will, one in which government is the customer, and there's a private sector. When does the private sector itself become the customer?
Well, of course, the private sector is a customer in the larger range of space transportation right now because of the communication satellite market. I think the question is, when does the private sector become the driving customer? When does it become the dominant customer? And for the smaller launch vehicles, I would say that would be if and when a system like the Motorola Iridium, for instance, with 77 satellites and one launch per month replacement to maintain the system comes into effect, because that launch requirement in and of itself would swamp all the government requirements forecast for the small launch deal. Not only is Motorola looking at this, but there's several other consortia looking at this as well, and it's quite likely that within 5 years you will have one or more of these low Earth orbit network consortia going. Once that happens, the bulk of launch activity demand in the small launch field becomes from a private commercial source. And I can tell you, just talking to Motorola, a lot of the assumptions the government people demand are absent, and the Motorola people and the other people that are plotting large private systems take a totally different view of it, and they start talking like, how many of these per month can you turn on? How many launches per month could you really do if we asked you to? You know, well, if we gave you a 5-year commitment for a block buy, which the government by law can't do, it would be a fundable commitment, unlike the government's commitment. That would really change the dynamics of it. So that's the third stage, is when the bulk of the driving demand comes from the private sector. And I believe that we can see that as early as 5 years from now.
An interesting aspect of Iridium, I didn't make the meeting, but weren't there 15 companies that made proposals
Yes.
at the launch? Is 15 the right number? I've forgotten the exact.
That's the right order of magnitude. I'm not sure if that's the actual number. And of course, it included several people that nobody had ever heard from before.
Questions by the panelists? We have time for another one or so. Questions from the audience? Sir.
I wonder if the chicken or the egg problem is not solvable by allowing a single company to do both functions, both provide the transportation and the actual service on orbit. Is that a reasonable way to go?
If you could raise the capital for it. The main problem has been that the amounts of capital available for private space projects has tended to be pretty limited. And no one to date has really been able to put together a business plan that shows both a payload function and a launch function that can be put together and that you could finance given a realistic cost for doing it. And the money has just not been there in the market. So it's, by necessity, has been done piecemeal. Certainly, we the launch companies have looked a number of times at trying to find some venture and get it funded. And so I know Space Services, for instance, tried very hard to get a private remote sensing venture funded to do exactly that. We looked at a couple of ventures which we tried real hard to get funded, but capital barriers were too high in the 80s.
Let me add about 3 more comments to that. The people who do launches are very different from people who do satellites. They may both be engineers, but they're different kinds of people. And when you do a startup, there are only so many people that you can find that are willing to work for nothing. And as soon as you get beyond, let's say, the 5, 6 people, you now need management people in there to orchestrate all of this, and you will tend to find that management people are the last ones who will work for free. So it is sort of a self-defeating prophecy, so to speak. You really can't get that many people together with those kinds of expertise and all do it for nothing. Well, my goodness. Yes, sir.
How many launches per year are occurring in the private field now, and what do you project in the future? And also, what about the price per pound? This was a big factor with the shuttle being so high, and how has the private launches influenced that, if at all?
Okay, right now what's happening is that we're in the latter stages of a transition from government to private operation in large satellite field. And if you count the U.S. companies like McDonnell Douglas, General Dynamics, Martin Marietta, I think we're going to do about 10 launches on the manifest this year. Probably 1 or 2 small ones. I think the Pegasus is due to go up sometime in summer or fall. And so it would make about 12. Depending on how you count Arianespace, that's another 10 or so. But that's a very different. I would definitely call Arianespace a quasi-private company because it's primarily owned by several European governments. Second part, the cost per pound of orbit. I'm not sure the figures for Delta or Titan, but I know the Atlas is come close to having its price over what they do on government contract, just because of the limiting government paperwork. In fact, the GD did a kind of an amazing thing and made a commitment on the part of the corporation to fund the building of 60 rockets, which all of a sudden gave you some economies of scale, which previously only the USSR had enjoyed. Of course, they still enjoy it on a lot larger scale than the US does. So you're getting some reduction in cost there. The real reduction in cost will come when the market can support the development of new private designs, at which point I would predict that we should be able to get down to certainly about $1,000 a pound over the current $60,000 to $80,000 a pound that you're actually paying. And beyond that, I think we'll be into looking at what new technology gets applied.
In fairness to the other speakers, I've got to cut it off, but we'll okay.
Yeah, Jim, would you agree that the cost per pound and the total dollar are really 2 figures that you should look at in a cost? The small launch vehicles reduce the total cost of a payload well below a Delta, but their cost per pound is usually more because of the, you lose the economy. So Pegasus, for instance, I think could be up to $10,000–$15,000 cost per pound, but you can get on for a 600, 700 pound bond.
Of course, we intend to try to attack both and have a small launch vehicle that both has a low absolute price and a low price per pound. But you're right, when you're going to do the experiment, what everyone asks is not what's the total efficiency the rocket gets, what you can get on board. This is for the individual payload user. On the other hand, if you're somebody like Motorola, you're doing so many launches over such a long period of time that you look at the cost per pound because you know that's the ultimate driver for what you can expect.
Now I must rise to my feet. Thank you very much. Please.